In this video, I'm going to be doing a ranking of all the films in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. I recently did a marathon where I alternated between watching the Nightmare on Elm Street films and alternating them with the Friday the 13th films, leading up to watching Freddy vs. Jason as part of his 20th anniversary. Obviously, it wouldn't be ideal to rank the Friday the 13th films and the Nightmare films together, so I'm going to be doing Nightmare first, and then the Friday rankings will come later. This order will go from worst to best, so sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy. There was no shortage of remakes of classic horror films in the early 2000s, and in 2010, Nightmare on Elm Street fell victim to that craze with the 2010 remake of the original film. The movie follows the predictable pattern you'd expect an Elm Street remake to have, but to the film's credit, it gets the series back to its quote-unquote scary roots and emphasis on what's terrifying about the whole nightmare concept in general, with the level of paranoia and terror that the teens feel. Where the film falls apart is the new Freddy in this. It's a reboot, so he's no longer played by Robert Englund. It's instead Jackie Earle Haley, who is a good actor. But the face in this looks terrible. It's a non-expressive face that actually looks like a burnt victim, and that's kind of not the point of what made Freddy Freddy. That combined with the voice just doesn't really match the persona that goes with the hat and striped sweater. That's the biggest reason why this film failed. Besides that, it just doesn't have much of a personality, especially in the second half. And of all the things Freddy's been through over the years, this film was the thing to finally kill him and the Nightmare films up to this point.
Fuck you.
Ooh, sounds like fun.
Nightmare 2: Freddy's Revenge was the first sequel to the smash success of the first film. To its credit, it's the only film in the series that comes the closest to replicating the original's tone, atmosphere, even with some of the great practical effects seen here. And it even still has Krueger still closest to his non-comedic persona seen in the original. The problem is that all of this is surrounded by a dogshit story that kind of misses the whole point of the nightmare concept from the original. It's also filled with characters you just couldn't give two shits about. It revolves around a kid named Jesse who ends up sort of turning into Freddy, and this climax is just kind of messy, and yeah, it's just a shit movie that's best left forgotten. Nightmare 5: The Dream Child is where the series officially jumps the shark in making Krueger overly comedic, which in my opinion isn't ideal, though the food kill with Greta was pretty good. My biggest problem with the movie is that it's just boring. It's a boring story that doesn't have a whole lot going for it besides Alice still being a solid protagonist. I mean, the idea of Freddy infiltrating the dreams of a baby in the womb should be kind of interesting, but the execution and just the overall story pacing just is not there. It's also the first Nightmare film without any real purpose going for it. You know, the first film was this introduction to this exciting new concept, then the second film you want to see more of that world, but then once that film completely shit the bed, then part 3 was all about redemption, and then part 4 was all about sort of paying off sort of the story elements in part 3. As for this film, it's just a whole lot of aimless adventure that doesn't have a whole lot going for it.
It's a boy!
The sixth installment, Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, continues part 5's jump into pure comedy, with Krueger just being a flat-out comedian at this point. I mean, he might as well be on Sesame Street, highlighted by some ridiculous kills like the video game kill in this. It's pure cringe. The first half of this film is really shitty. It's just god-awful filmmaking in a lot of aspects. But admittedly, the second half of the film is a lot better once you get the interplay between Freddy and his daughter and what the story is really about here, and also seeing more of Freddy's backstory, which was warranted 5 sequels in, as anything that was mysterious or intimidating about Freddy is gone at this point. Yeah, the second half of this film is a lot better than the first half, but the movie is still overall held back by a god-awful first half.
Beat my high score.
Wes Craven's New Nightmare from 1994 isn't part of the main series continuity. It takes place in the quote-unquote real world of the behind the scenes of the Nightmare films, with the actors, filmmakers, and even Wes Craven himself being haunted by an actual supernatural manifestation of Freddy in the real world. The main one we follow here is Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy in part 1 and 3. The film plays out more like a psychological thriller a la Smile, rather than the nightmare slasher scenarios of the main films. This approach is mostly successful, as the goal of this film was to deliver a much more scarier film than what was showcased in the latter sequels. There's proper levels of escalation here in the grand scheme of things. You do feel the craziness that Nancy, or rather Langkamp, feels in this as things go along through the film and things get crazier and crazier. Unfortunately, you don't get to see a whole lot of this new Krueger, who is definitely a lot different from what was seen after the original Nightmare films, though I've always thought that the glove here was just kind of weird. There were parts of the film I enjoyed here and there, but I definitely don't think it's a great overall movie. I think it's more of a decent one-off scenario of the Nightmare films.
Don't stop it, you're scaring me.
Freddy vs. Jason pays off the ending showed in Jason Goes to Hell, as it pits Freddy against the star/villain of the Friday the 13th series, Jason Voorhees. Now, the plot to bring these two together is pretty clever. Freddy needing to spread fear in Springwood, thereby bringing Jason back to do so and kill a bunch of people. Of course, the versus part comes into play when Jason won't stop killing, taking Freddy's potential victims. Therefore, Freddy decides to bring the fight to Jason to take him down. The actual movie itself goes through the ups and downs when it comes to quality, although thankfully it never reaches the point where it's just downright terrible, though the final 40 minutes is pretty good and pretty consistent. Looking at this film from Freddy's perspective, given how this is a Nightmare on Elm Street rankings video, the film plays out much more like an Elm Street movie than a Friday film, but that makes sense since Freddy's the one that's pulling the strings in this when it comes to the plot. Though it is a versus film, Freddy ends up being more the real villain in this overall, since the group of teens decide to use Jason to kill Freddy in this, since he's the one that sort of started all this torment going on in Springwood where they live. Though in the battle of who's the more effective killer, it's definitely Jason in this, whose body count dwarfs Freddy's in this film. The movie undoubtedly shines though in the ultimate battle between the two in the real world towards the end. There's great choreography and energy. It gets gushier and redder as it goes along, showing that these two are the best of what they do. For those reasons and more, I consider it to be one of my all-time favorite guilty pleasures. Nightmare 4: The Dream Master does a smart thing in trying to replicate the elements that made its immediate predecessor successful. It doesn't replicate those all-around elements quite as well, but that's more of a commentary on how good its predecessor was. Now here the series was transitioning from being scary to being more fun than anything, but I think this movie finds a decent balance of being fun yet atmospheric and having an all-around good Freddy here. The best thing this movie has going for it is its emphasis on Freddy trapping the souls of his victims in his body, something teased and shown a little bit in the previous installment. It's bad enough to get killed by Krueger, but then you have to endure what could be an eternity of being tortured in his body. Yikes. This leads to his most memorable and coolest defeat in any of the films.
You shouldn't have buried me. I'm not dead.
The original Nightmare on Elm Street is the series at its creepiest and most atmospheric, as it was Freddy at its most terrifying and effective when it came to being scary, with zero of the comedy that would be seen in the later installments. I also just love the grim, filthy kind of look this movie has. That might be more of a product of its low budget and when it was made, but this movie just has such a special look that can't be replicated these days, with its use of practical effects and just the trippiness of some of the sequences, all of which just add to why this movie was a smash success that ended up launching a franchise.
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
Nightmare 3: Dream Warriors somewhat abandons the concept of trying to be scary like its predecessors and opts to be more of a fantasy adventure type film, and a damn good one at that. It definitely has the best collection of characters of any of the films. They're all really likable, which makes it sad when they end up getting killed off. It was also great to have Nancy back, as she was sorely missing in the second installment. I think this is what makes Freddy at his best as a villain here, because of how you're rooting for the kids in this, and when they end up getting killed by him, it's like, ah, damn, I kind of like that kid. I think this movie finds the best balance of having Freddy being a scary, intimidating force with bits of humor and some great one-liners thrown in there. You get a great all-around Freddy, great all-around story and characters, and in my opinion, the best film in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. So there you have it with my ranking of all the films in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. It's been over 13 years since Freddy's been on the big screen, so I think you can safely say at this point that Freddy's dead and the Nightmare films to go with it. But you know that this is such a legacy series that you just know or feel that it'll be brought back in some way eventually, maybe even in the form of a TV show, you never know. As I mentioned, this was part of my Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th marathon that I did as part of Freddy vs. Jason's 20th anniversary. As far as when you can expect the Friday the 13th ranking video to be done, well, keep an eye out for a certain Friday in October and maybe you'll see it. You never know. So that'll do it for this ranking of all the films in the Nightmare series. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching and I hope you have sweet dreams.